3, 2, 1. Nice. Okay, brilliant. I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Robyn.
This is Mikey, and we've been working together over the last few months to bring you our new podcast, Reflecting Value, from our makeshift at-home studios. Reflecting Value is a podcast where we explore the big questions relating to cultural value in a reflective space. And in this episode, we're focusing on how we can bring the two very different worlds of culture and health together. You're about to hear from 4 guests working to bridge the gap between culture and health. They all joined us over Zoom and shared their reflections on the strengths and challenges of achieving this. And with that said, all that's left to do now is to grab a cup of tea, sit back and join us for the next half an hour. Oh, and I'm Robyn, by the way. Welcome to Reflecting Value.
Hello, I'm Veronica Franklin-Gould, founder of Arts for Dementia, which was inspired by a cellist playing very, very high-quality Bach to my mother 7 years into her diagnosis of Alzheimer's. She was struggling to speak, and to my absolute astonishment, her communication skills came back, albeit briefly.
Arts for Dementia is a charity that supports people living with dementia to access cultural activities. They're particularly interested in the ways that social prescribing can make this happen. I spoke to Veronica back in November to hear more about this work.
I remember at an early UK Dementia Congress meeting, there was time for one last question, and I threw up my arms. And at the sound of arts, there was a great groan in the room. Arts, what a wasted question. And how wonderful it is that things have changed, because at the UK Congress now, Dementia Congress now, they devote days or large sections to arts. But God, it was hard work to start off with.
Why do you think that is?
It was hard. This was hard because it wasn't medical. And the thing about social prescribing, whose language is often, we've discovered, can often be challenged. But the great thing about social prescribing is that it gives doctors something to prescribe. Because with certain types of dementia, they can't prescribe anything. With others, they can. It was terribly hard to reach the busy, it was even before they were called community mental health teams, but it was even hard to reach them, certainly people in the Alzheimer's Society. They just had so much on their plate that arts was just an awful lot. And but over the years, they have been fantastic.
So I was particularly interested about integrating social prescribing early on in a person's dementia diagnosis journey. How have you gone about approaching this idea with GPs, social prescribers, link workers, and what are your plans going forwards?
This is a terribly exciting question because ever since setting up Arts for Dementia, I've been working towards direction to arts for people on diagnosis to counteract the shock of having our most feared condition. And the wonder of social prescribing, having a link worker in the surgery with more than the 10-minute GP's time to be able to discuss a person's actual interests gives us the opportunity to reach people who, while they're awaiting their memory assessment, and it can be months. I heard yesterday 9 months. You might have to wait for a brain scan. And social prescribing link workers can enable people to access arts very much earlier in that frightening period, the most frightening period, when they're worried about symptoms, they're worried about stigma, there's a terrible trauma, will my friends keep away, what will I be, all of that sort of thing. If they're engaged in art, working towards a creative outcome, whether it be art, dance, drama, men's sheds, horticulture, if they're working towards an outcome, a creative outcome, when diagnosis comes, they'll know how much they can achieve and enjoy in life, shared cultural interests, their views valued, despite dementia. So it sets them up, keeps them connected for that glorious, seamless, lifelong enjoyment of the arts or new discoveries.
So this is obviously something you're really, really passionate about. And I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit more about how you're going to take this work forwards.
So in order to press this forward with this, first of all, we had a conference with the heads of personalised care, national health and care, in social prescribing, at the Wellcome Collection in May 2019. And since then, we've been planning a programme of monthly, it's now even more frequent than that, regional events, conversations, bringing together leads in academics and culture, health and wellbeing, the regional heads of culture, health and wellbeing, the social prescribing network, clinical leads in dementia, GP leads in dementia and social prescribing, with their link workers, with the arts organisations, making lists of as many arts activities as we could find, because there's no good in encouraging social prescribing if they haven't got something to prescribe to. And then our aim is that local authorities who are brilliant at supporting arts prescriptions, if the NHS can be convinced by the evidence to match fund the local authority contribution, that will create and enable ongoing sustainable arts prescriptions.
Veronica invited me to speak at one of these events the day before this interview in order to share the centre's findings relating to culture on referral. The event brought a large range of voices to the same, albeit virtual, room and left my brain buzzing with the possibilities for social prescribing for those living with dementia. And the great thing was that it was just one of many consultation events headed up by Arts for Dementia. Back to Veronica.
We are continuing these regional programmes. We will then make case studies, and our aim is, although it doesn't sound exciting, the result will be exciting. Our aim is to produce models to enable sustainable arts to continue. Not usually arts programmes are 8 weeks and they're time limited and funded by wonderful trusts and foundations whose support we will always value. But we need them to continue too. And so, because it's no good for a doctor prescribing a lovely arts programme, only to find that by the time their patient takes it up, it's finished. So our challenge is to create these sustainable programmes for which partnerships and funding and collaboration are absolutely key.
Talking to Veronica, it seems as if one of the real benefits in aligning the worlds of culture and health is in enabling this kind of sustainability, so that when a person is referred to a programme, it's still available to them. So while Arts for Dementia have brought together many voices to discuss these challenges, are there any practical examples that show this value?
They believed these WhatsApp messages that were being shared across their networks. I warned Fola, don't share them. They are full of lies, making people scared.
But the most important thing really is, how will they know if the vaccine will work on people like us and be safe for people like us if they can't test it on people like us?
ਜਿਵੇਂ ਸਾਡਾ ਆਮ ਵੇਚਣ ਵਾਲਾ ਆਦਮੀ ਉਹਨੇ WhatsApp ਤੇ ਪੋਸਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਜ਼ਬਰਦਸਤੀ ਵੈਕਸੀਨ ਦੇਣਗੇ ਤੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਫਿਰ ਕਰੋਨਾ ਹੋ ਜਾਏਗਾ. Tell him it is not a live vaccine, mum, and no one will be forced to have it.
These clips are taken from the COVID and Me film series, a collaboration between the National Institute for Health Research, University of Leeds and Theatre of Debate, with the aim of supporting different communities in understanding the importance of taking part in COVID-19 vaccine research.
Okay, we both recording?
Yeah, we're both recording.
I spoke to Professor Sue Pavitt and her colleague Dr. Shamaila Anwar about what made them decide to make the COVID and Me films. So just to start off, could you tell me a little bit more about why you wanted to make these films?
So when the pandemic started, it was quite clear that the patient voice needed to be brought into the work that was going on. We needed to engage people from particular communities that were being having very poor outcomes if they contracted COVID. We needed them to engage with research so that the research we were doing meant that the results were going to be applicable across all communities. And William Vantoff, who's now the CEO of the National Institute of Health Research, commissioned me to start to do COVID and Me. And that was the first series of monologues that we produced. And then we went on to do a more recent second series on COVID and Me vaccines. Broadly speaking, they are there to encourage people from underserved communities from 4 particular groups in particular. So we were looking at older people with comorbidities who are over 50, those from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, and underpinning that, people from areas of social deprivation. And those groups actually map on quite well to the groups that also have vaccine hesitancy now. So it's been quite a useful journey to be able to expand the project into it.
Why film and using professional actors?
I think for me, there's 2 main things. There's the ability to communicate this information to people who can't necessarily read and write, both from my own community and also, from other communities as well. So we've got to remember that literacy within kind of, pardon the expression, white communities is also something that we need to think about. I think that's first and foremost. The second thing is in having those cultural references so that if there's no point in us producing something that is not going to resonate or have an impact with the communities that they want to reach, and being able to do that in a way that's kind of culturally relevant. So having writers from those communities, having actors from that community was really, really important to ensure that we get the cultural relevance right and that they resonate and they have that impact. Because at the end of the day, people don't want to read through reams and reams of a leaflet. They don't want to listen through reams and reams of information, even if it's on a video. It's about getting those key messages right and being put into a format that is entertaining and that is culturally relevant. And I think for me, those are the 2 biggest reasons why we've done this.
It's really interesting to hear. There's so much crossover with a lot of the research that I've been doing in this area. So I'm really interested in kind of digging down into this idea of sort of the role of semi-famous actors and in this area, and what do you think that will bring to these messages?
So one of our characters, Varsha, is played by Shaheen Khan, who was the actor in Bend It Like Beckham. She was the mom in Bend It Like Beckham. So she's someone that is known and people recognise. But it's been really fascinating talking to her about being involved in the project, because she said as an Asian actor, she doesn't often get parts that are powerful women parts. And this is very much a story that has been developed that is very much about the female matriarch in that society. And do you want to elaborate maybe on that, Shamaila?
I think first and foremost, just going back to the kind of the point about kind of the empowerment of women. I think that traditionally it's always thought that Asian communities are very patriarchal. They're led by the men, but actually in reality it's the women, it's the mothers that lead that community. And men go out, they've got a life outside of their home, but women tend to have their life within their own homes. They live their life through their children, and the impact that you can have on future generations from educating the mothers is quite profound, I think. And so it's really kind of helping us to understand and engage. And I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest kind of impacts for me of the COVID and Me initiative is actually understanding the communities that we need to be serving. And I think that when you dig deeper down the Asian community, the issues aren't so much about the vaccination itself, it's about a mistrust in government and government organisations. And that's probably, we don't need to sort of go into the detail of that, but I think that stems from, kind of the fear of discrimination, which has happened in the past, and also institutional racism. So if you actually dig down deeper, the issue isn't the actual vaccines, it's about it's the messaging that's coming from the government, and that is a difficult thing that we're trying to sort of overturn, and trying to sort of say that the vaccination is a separate thing, and actually where we are trying to sort of ensure that they are appropriately represented within that.
But I think the power of them really comes from the way that we set about doing this very much a co-production approach. So we have these powerful workshops where we bring people together from lots of different backgrounds, and they're sharing their ideas and they're sharing their voices and their experiences. And the script writers are there hearing this and also knowing the brief of what we're wanting to try and do. And it becomes that they use the power of storytelling, but they're basing it on the lived experiences of the communities that we're trying to reach. What we've done is that each monologue will have a key message that we want to get out there, but it's done in a very subtle way, and it's done in a sort of still in a way where people can make their own choices and minds up. And I think that's the difference with something. You're often left at the end thinking about something rather than being told this is what you've got to do. And I think that's a much more engaging way to make people feel supported, that they can make their own decision. Whatever it is, it's about empowering them to make their own decision about these choices that they have. But it's also reminding people that they've got their own responsibility about their own health.
I think for me, on a personal level, it's been quite a journey, because my cultural background and my is normally just to, you're kind of seen and you're not heard, and I think that visibility is something very new to my community. And although it was quite quite negative at first, because obviously it was my community that has been disproportionately affected, I think that now we're seeing the best of my community coming together. And I think certainly from my perspective, being involved in this initiative, the opportunities that it's given me, like, for example, doing the podcast with the National Vaccine Task Force, being invited to interviews, radio stations along with Sue, has been phenomenal. And it's kind of helped me find my voice.
Sue and Shamaila highlight some really important points about the value of using films in health communication, especially when it comes to building trust at a time when false news and misinformation are abundant. But are there any challenges that arise when we align culture and health too closely?
It's funny, someone said to me, Mike, this morning, you're a bit of a rebel. I don't think I am a rebel, because rebels are inside the system. I think when I talk about this stuff, I feel more like a Martian, someone coming in and speaking an entirely different language.
This is Mike Chitty, who was head of applied leadership at the NHS Leadership Academy. I asked Mike if he could tell me why he was so interested in this area of work.
Why am I interested in this area of work? Well, my big beef is that most of what we spend on health and well-being, as in our National Health Service, is actually spent on illness management. And most of that illness is actually created by a lack of connection to self-expression, belonging, community, culture, purpose. It's the old alienation thing. So my big interest here is how, by investing more in whatever we mean by culture, what people do, what makes people feel like they belong, how that could actually mean that we could massively slice our health budgets and get them focusing on the illnesses that we aren't generated by ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's really important in terms of kind of a lot of the sort of research we're doing is very sort of interventional in nature, sort of how do we make a difference in terms of health and wellbeing outcomes, but a lot of it is lacking the context in which these kind of cultural programs might take place in, and it's kind of the healthcare system itself is forgotten about, but also the culture is forgotten about because people aren't describing what's happening when people are engaging with it.
And then I think as well, when you talk about culture as an industry rather than as a social artifact, things start to get very weird. And essentially what I see happening is the arts sniffing around for crumbs from the table of health and care. We've got £130 billion illness management industry in the NHS alone. Crumbs will get thrown at arts and health and well-being and nature and that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, what we won't recognise is that that £130 billion budget depends for its existence on the creation of illness. So yeah, I think there's a really radical approach needed to start thinking differently about how we create health and well-being, and it's not about spending crumbs on diverting people from illness.
So in an ideal world, this kind of radical approach, how would you see that working in practice? What would be radical enough to make that difference?
Well, it's funny, out my window here I can see the Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust, which is, I think, a £1.3 billion business, £1.4 billion business. And I often think if we could take maybe half of that money away and pump it into arts, health, well-being, creation, if we could only manage that transition, we could have much more investment in giving people lives that they value, and therefore less addiction, less depression, less alienation. We could actually establish a very different kind of community and society.
I was wondering whether you maybe had any success stories with bringing together culture and health that you could share.
I suppose they're just absolutely all around us. It's the way that art actually stops us from having to engage so much with the illness world rather than the health world. So what I'm trying to describe is that the success stories aren't seen as success stories because they're not evaluated in terms of pilots and how much did they save us and what did they do in reducing clinical interventions and all that sort of stuff. A couple of the really things that have really moved me over the years. I've done bits of work for over a decade now with Solace, who do psychotherapeutic interventions with survivors of refugees and asylum seekers who are survivors of trauma, deep trauma. And, they do psychotherapeutic clinical interventions. And the things that really complement that are some of the really quite profound pieces of work they do around things like just conversation and art and food. And these things almost don't get seen as health interventions. They're sort of hived off and seen as something else. But one of the reasons why that place is so successful is because people go there because they feel like they belong to it. They're treated as people, not as symptoms and as illnesses and as problems. They're treated as people. And so I suppose, those success stories are success stories almost because they're not noticed. They're just people, using culture, whatever I mean by that, using their own modes of expression, their own modes of being to connect and to really heal themselves. And I suppose that's another part of this model is that we're capable of looking after ourselves so much more when we're given access to connection and community and culture. And it's when we're denied access to those things that actually we start to need more medical, clinical, pharmaceutical interventions. And I'm just trying to think in terms of, I think there's a lot of emerging good practice around social prescribing, but my fear is that the more it emerges as good practice, the more it'll get captured by the illness management system.
Yeah, that's something that I'm definitely finding in the research that we've been doing is kind of the scales are tipped so far in the direction of outcome that process is not really considered and what it actually means to take part in that kind of community.
Yeah, that whole language of outcomes is deeply problematic, I think, especially when it comes to arts and culture. In health, we know what the outcomes are. We want to take pressure off primary care, pressure off secondary care. We can be clear on what we're aiming for. I think when we're into the world of art and culture, we're actually not really aiming for anything other than self-expression, connection, belonging. And what comes out of cultural work is almost impossible. Well, I say almost impossible to measure. I don't think it should be measured. I think there are some things that are qualities and forms rather than quantities. And we need to recognise the difference between what can be measured, a quantity, and qualities and forms that actually can't really be captured in that same way. And the world of outcomes is just fixated with quantities, absolutely fixated with quantities. And also this overly simplistic causal correlation. If we do that, we get these outcomes. Well, I'm afraid there's almost nothing in this world now where we can say if we do that, we get these outcomes. If we do that, we disturb this massively complex, adaptive, social, multi-minded system. And we get a whole array of outcomes, most of which we have no understanding of or no awareness of. There might be a few things we're looking for, like does this reduce admissions into A&E? Does this reduce admissions into primary care? But, they're tiny, minuscule slivers of all the things that actually come out of meaningful arts and culture-based projects.
So what can we take away from these conversations? It's clear that there's real value in aligning the worlds of culture and health when it comes to developing trust with different communities and affording opportunities for cultural engagement when facing a diagnosis of dementia. But there are clearly some challenges. We know that there are issues when it comes to sustainability and funding within this area. Who is responsible for funding culture, health and wellbeing programmes so that they're available in the long term? And what evidence is needed to make the case for that funding? We've also heard that there's a challenge when it comes to over-medicalising culture, rather than seeing the ways in which culture can afford feelings of belonging and connection and enable self-expression, which may coincidentally lead to better health and wellbeing outcomes. I think today's conversation is a starting block for further reflection, and I'd be really interested to hear what you think going forwards. Can you think of a time when aligning the worlds of culture and health was really valuable? How might aligning these worlds change the ways in which you communicate and convey the value of your practice? That's all from me. Thank you for listening to Reflecting Value, a podcast from the Centre for Cultural Value. To keep up to date on reflections from this episode and to hear how other people have answered these questions, search #ReflectingValue on Twitter. And don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. See you next time.